Welcome to Conversations with Andrew, where we aim to discuss everything to do with 21st century learning. I am your host, Andrew Hibling, and I'm also the co-founder and CEO of Edge Education. For those that don't know, Edge is on a quest to design the future of learning, and we believe that how and why we learn is as important as what we learn. I'm joined today by our very own learning design specialist, Ms. Katherine Fourie, and she is also the co-author of the article Social Learning, Buzzword or Best Practice. And then I'm joined by Mr. Janse Maritz, Edge's very own Chief Academic Officer and my co-founder and partner in crime, and together the two of them run Edge's Academic Design Unit. So welcome to both of you. Good to have you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew.
All right, so let's jump into our discussion. We're very excited to be here and maybe just team this up with the article that has been written by myself, yourself, and Jana. And this is really a discussion around that article, but around social learning at large. So, Katie, I think we'll jump in straight with you first, and maybe let's just have a look at existing social learning tools that are out there and existing learning management systems, learning experience systems. What are those tools? Do people use them? How are they integrated?
Sure. So I think in most LMSs, we find very similar tools. So those typically range from your standard chat tool to wikis, discussion forums, and so on. And then, of course, now with COVID, we've been making a lot more use of platforms like Zoom and Blackboard Collaborate, so conferencing tools. But what we are seeing is that these are often used adjunctively to the actual course. So they're added onto the course, they're nice to have, but they're not integrated into the course as such. So, I mean, you can join the Zoom session if you're free. If you're not, we'll post a recording of it. You can participate in the discussion forum, but we're not going to force you, so we're not going to grade you on it. So, there's still a bit of apprehension around social learning and really integrating it into the core of a course.
And I suppose, it's relatively new, right? So there's bound to be a degree of apprehension both on the educator side and on the student side as we kind of progress into the 21st century.
No, absolutely. I think it's about being in a safe space. Students, the default position is generally that people are worried as to whether they're going to take a risk.
Yeah.
If they're going to do something, make a post, or if they upload even a profile picture, what is the consequence of that? What are they getting themselves into? That apprehension one needs to address up front.
Okay. Perfect. I think let's jump into the meat of that article now and just have a look at the bit of the theory and the kind of what was written there. Maybe we can just start off with defining social learning. And there's obviously two aspects to that. There's the social and the learning side. Maybe you could just unpack that a little for us, Janse.
No, absolutely. So I think it's worthwhile, discussing the meaning of social, as you said. So for me, it finds its application in our relation with humans and collaborating inside a community or inside a group. And the following from that, obviously the social learning side of it is then in this group either changing or creating new behaviors, new knowledge, new skills, attitudes, even values, even in some cases, new views on how the world works, and doing that through engagement with your participants in that community.
100%.
So it's not really a new thing. I mean, social learning, there's this word and there's this hype and this banter and conversations happening all over the place. But social learning, it's not really a new thing. And maybe we can just look at social learning from or through the lens of the learning theories and maybe just have a look there as to the existence of social learning from that perspective, Katie.
Sure. So, in a brief nutshell, because there's so much to say about it. So in our article, we looked at 4 sort of core learning theories, but there are quite a significant number of others. But if we look at behaviorism, for example, and we look at the role of the educator there, it is to prompt learners to then, we're prompting learners and we're wanting them to sort of display a desired response, we're using techniques such as repetition, reinforcement. So the learner is really responding to what the teacher is doing.
There's like a stimulus and then there's a response.
100%.
Okay.
So with cognitivism, on the other hand, we're now paying a lot more attention to the internal mental state. So it's not just about external behavior. We're looking at the processes of storage of information, retrieval, transformation of that information. So again, the role of the educator there is to really create an environment that is conducive to these mental processes, which then enables the student to make sense of this information.
So maybe just contrasting then cognitivism versus behaviorism. Behaviorism is that sort of stimulus response, where cognitivism is really focusing on the internal process of information processing.
Absolutely. And then if we look at constructivism, it takes cognitivism a step further, where we're not solely focused on this information processing anymore. So it's moving away from seeing humans as almost computers that process information to more of a, I want to say, almost humane approach, where the student is now the creator of their own meaning. So the role of the educator in that context is really to provide an environment in which the student can collaborate with others and reflect on what they've learned and make meaning of this information. So it's almost a sort of social construction of reality.
For themselves.
Yes.
They're building their own knowledge and their own reality.
Exactly, and that touches on what Janse said earlier about, those changed behaviors as a result of interactions with others. It's exactly that. And then lastly, we looked at connectivism, which is all about connecting with different sources of knowledge. So the role of the educator there would be to put the learner in touch with other students, other educators, other sources of knowledge that they can then use to make meaning of the information, and it relies largely on sort of pattern identification. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's what the learning theory is saying.
Facilitating those connections.
100%.
Connectivism. Maybe we could just talk now a little bit about a framework, the community of inquiry framework, and how that's a framework, if you will, for social learning, and how that relates to engagement. It's no secret that Edge loves and supports the community of inquiry framework. It's our baby. We love the concepts behind it. So Katie, maybe you could just discuss a little bit about that, relating the presences in the community of inquiry.
Sure. So like Andrew said, the community of inquiry really is a framework for social learning. And according to the community of inquiry, there are three presences that sort of mediate an educational experience, or that are required for a successful educational experience. And those three presences are social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence. So social presence, in its simplest form, is engagement with peers. So the sort of more lengthy definition is really the ability of students in a community of inquiry to project themselves as real people and to project their true personalities. So they can do so through, putting up profile pictures, using emojis in chat, any way really to convey who you are as a person.
In the community.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas cognitive presence is more about engagement with the content. So the sort of essence of cognitive presence is practical inquiry, which is this 4-step process, which is essentially problem-based learning. But it really centers on this purposeful content. And then teaching presence.
And it's teaching
Teaching presence, not teacher presence. Teaching presence is really all about engagement regarding the goals and directions of learning. So in a very simple form, engagement with the instructor, but on a much broader scale, it's more about directing the other two presences and ensuring that sort of social presence is being guided in the right direction, engagement with the content is being guided in the right direction, the students know what is expected of them. So yeah.
Wow, very succinct.
Sure.
And important there as well is the relationship, as you touched on at the end, between the different presences, how social presence is to a certain extent dependent on that teaching presence, but also how those relationships change over time is quite an interesting part of understanding that in the context of your learning design. And maybe, Janse, that's a perfect time to tee up your field research that you did. You took these concepts of the community of inquiry framework with its teaching cognitive and social presence, and you delivered that in a course. And you were the facilitator, and you were challenged and charged with creating these presences. How did that go for you?
Yeah, so it was tough. It was an interesting group. I think maybe just to reflect on what Katie was saying about social presence, it's obviously important for the student to identify what the group is in, right? And that's very important for somebody to feel there's a safe space. This is a safe space for them to voice an opinion, to bring their personality into a group. And I think that's the ultimate goal in a well orchestrated community of inquiry, is when you've got social presence where people feel they can be themselves, where they feel there's no fear or favor in the group, and they are learning in the process. So this field study we did was for a professional body study. So it was accounting, and there were 15 students, a lovely group. We had a nice spread of demographic. There were some digital natives in there. There were even digital immigrants, and you could say some people never picked up a computer before they were given the tools. Some never understood the subject. They've never done accounting before. Others were adolescents, adults, some in their 30s.
And not to mention the kind of device and data
challenges. So there were some with data challenges. I mean, we had an incident where a student was on a group with somebody else's cell phone and said, sorry, it's actually not me chatting. I'm actually on Peter's phone. And, so you get those challenges. But it was challenging initially. I think in the first 3 days of the research, we had very little interaction. We asked people to upload their profile pictures, started chatting about, you sort of like don't plan it initially when you're doing it for the first time. Then, I thought to myself, look, let's see if we can make this a safe space. So I remember the one day, that was 3 days into the program, I sat in the parking lot at the gym with a t-shirt on. And I said, now I'm going to take my phone and I'm going to take a video and I'm going to post it on the group. So all I did was, hi guys, it's Janse here. I'm here to help you. I know some of you have never done accounting before. I know some of you are struggling with your data. Some of you have got great access, but we're all here in a community together. And I see in the first week, you guys have to learn about assets and expenses and whatever. And I said, look, tell me, what do you think? Why does accountants regard stationery as an expense and not as an asset? What do you guys think?
So you had a conversation?
Posted that on the group. All of a sudden, the profile pics came up. People started chatting, because then they feel, okay, well, actually, I can sit here in my t-shirt and I can be myself and I can contribute to the group. And I think, look, it's still challenging. In retrospect, I think you need to preempt it, but I'll get into that a bit later,
That's quite a powerful tool, to just be able to record a video note right there and then put it into the community space and be able to initiate a conversation, like in a mobile environment on your way to the gym. So, and I think that's lends itself to social presence and teaching presence. It's that availability. It's being present. In one of the other research surveys or projects we've done recently as well, that, I think, to paraphrase you here, Katie, they cry out for teaching presence and being available, and having their teachers and their facilitators present in their learning, in their courseware that they're learning. Let's just change tack a little bit here. We've talked about social learning, we've talked about the definition of social learning, we've talked about that social learning in the context of the learning theories, we've talked about it in the context of the community of inquiry framework with its three presences, teaching, social and cognitive presence. And then Janse, you've taken us through particularly the social presence element in your field research that you've done. But maybe we could just talk a little bit about the inquiry element of the community of inquiry. And in particular, the small group environment. So the inquiry, as you mentioned earlier, it focuses on problematization, information synthesis and reflection. And then, of course, that critical discourse that then follows in from a social presence perspective. But the point is, it's in this small group where the magic happens and where true social expression happens.
Definitely, and I think this relates to what Janse was saying earlier as well about creating a safe space. Because I think if most of us were asked to stand up in front of a group of 50 people, 200 people in a lecture hall, and to share what we thought about a particular topic, it would be a very stressful experience. Whereas if we're in smaller groups, and there's still a lot of debate as to what the ideal group number actually is, and Janse, I think you'll probably have some thoughts on that given your experience. But in a smaller group, it's a lot easier to, come forth with your opinion. Probably a little bit because you can't hide in the back of a lecture hall, but also because you get to know your participants. So that degree of social presence is so much higher. You know who these people are, you trust them, and we can share our thoughts, we can actually converse. It's not a unidirectional sort of I'm standing up and sharing with you and now I'm sitting down, or raising my hand on Zoom and then saying my say, and that's
again, it's a conversation.
It's engaging, yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder, we were talking about one of the faculties of health sciences using a problem-based approach where their group size is around about sort of 12, 13. Is that too big? Is the better group size 2, 3, 4, less than 5? Or is 10 better? Or is 20 better? And it reminded me of this, of team-based learning where you have a larger cohort of students, but then within that larger cohort, you also have a smaller cohort. But even in that smaller cohort, it's quite a substantial number of people.
Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing there is what do these digital tools facilitate? Do they facilitate larger groups? Are we able to have more students participating in these groups? And also, does the digital environment afford more of a safe space for people to engage and be themselves socially?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting what Katie was saying there. My experience was that smaller groups were better. What was very illuminating at the end with the survey questions was on this field study was that there were some that didn't participate, but afterwards clearly indicated that they followed every conversation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they were watching what was going on. They were still making their own notes based on the discussions. So it was just a case of maybe not feeling safe yet, but certainly got a bit of a fear of missing out, I suppose.
Yeah.
But they were feeling the teaching presence.
Yep.
They were still benefiting from that teaching presence, which is one of the presences. Okay, I think, Janse, if we could just build a little bit on what you were saying about teaching presence and then just the concept of the transactional learning experience and how that's kind of different to as you mentioned the word, Katie, a unidirectional thing. Like, what is the transactional learning experience, Janse?
Yeah, so I think for the cognitive and social presence to be sort of productive and sustainable, you're going to need that teaching presence the learning will have to be directed. It will have to be designed and it will have to be facilitated. You can't have, it's really a transaction between the teacher and that cohort. And the role of the teaching presence is really to make sure that that harmony exists between the different elements in that community of inquiry. So the teacher needs to plan. I think in retrospect, if I had to do that cohort again or that field study again, I would plan it better. Things that we did in our stride as we went along and created things that could create engagement. We created smaller groups for assignments, and it sort of created a transaction in terms of their assignment study. They had to prepare for an assignment, and with their assessments, they created their answers were done on an online environment. So what we did was we created different groups, and in the different groups, we inserted a Google Sheet, and then asked the students to participate and collaborate in completing these assignments, which is, in retrospect, something we should have created from the beginning. We should have said from the beginning at that time, that's going to be the design, and on that date, we're going to release that, rather than sort of thinking about it a week later. So I think the transactional experience is about creating that balance, but it has to be designed, it's got to be planned, and you've got to stick to your curriculum, because at the end, you've got a set of outcomes and you've got a certain time in which you've got to do it. And the transaction for the student is he wants to get his qualification and he wants to be competent at the end and be a person with a certain graduate attribute at the end. And the teacher has the role of making sure that that happens in a structured environment.
It's quite interesting as well in defining and understanding, Katie, teaching presence. We often focus on the teacher's actual presence in the social forum or the community, but the role of the teacher is a lot deeper than that. Janse's just touched on it from a course design perspective, from a materials design perspective, from a planning perspective, from a curriculum perspective, timetable perspective. That's also an element of teaching presence, because all of that planning, as you say, needs to be coordinated.
Absolutely, and something that I love so much, and also one of your stories, but you mentioned that in the smaller groups you actually noticed that some of the students stepped up and took on the role of the teacher and were assisting other
That
students.
was amazing.
And
that's what you want, right?
I love that so much, because that is the point of this entire exercise. Is in order to create a sustainable community of inquiry, the teacher is not going to be able to be there all the time or on an ongoing basis. So if you can empower students to almost start taking on that role, and you can step back a little bit and be like, ensure that you're hitting the necessary outcomes within the specified time, but you're not inserting yourself into discussions or things, because the students are actually now taking on that role themselves. 100%. That is exactly what you want to achieve.
Yeah, exactly. I think what does help with tools in a proper social learning space or tool is when you've got the opportunity to redirect discussions that go haywire. That helped a lot. So you want people to go off track, you want them, but when you realize everyone is missing the boat here, you can just say, guys, I'm just leaving a voice note. Guys, I see that you're saying this, you've got a point there, but have a look at this and see what you think about this. It just sort of like brings them back. And then, that's really the role. It's facilitation, but the teacher is central there. Yeah.
It's quite interesting that, because that builds actually a little bit on the importance of subject matter expertise from a teaching perspective, and how that affects the facilitation role. Do you or do you not have an SME? But I don't think we'll can of worms today. Let's just jump in a little bit then, Katie. So we've talked now again, sort of just seeing how this whole conversation is flowing. We've talked about the community of inquiry, the different presences. We've talked about how Janse did it practically. We've talked about the notion of it being a transactional experience. When you're getting into it, there's that transaction. But right from the outset, now you're trying to build this program, and you in your current studies, they're also utilizing a community of inquiry approach. So how do you initiate that? How does it start? What's the first thing that you've got to do?
Sure. So for us, we were thrown a bit in the deep end. It was, you've joined the program, you need to upload your profile picture. We needed to submit a video introducing ourselves. And then first assignment was discussion forums. Like, off you go, you had to respond to a minimum of 5 people. And so, they pushed the social presence very hard from the beginning. But I think for us, what's so important is to really, really start integrating that into the course design. And I thought this was such a nice example of doing that, where it's not just an add-on extra, it's not just a nice to have, it's not just if you feel like it, you can engage, if you don't, skip over it. It is actually a core part of the learning of that course. Like, if you're not engaging in this, you're going to miss out on something very important. So
it's inherent.
Absolutely.
It's inherent in the design. I mean, different people have tried different things. They've tried to grade it. They've had a discussion forum and, said that if you engage, then you'll get a certain grade for that engagement. But again, it's not inherent. It's not built into the very fabric of that learning design, which is what we're obviously discussing here. And that's what the community of inquiry framework builds on. It's making it part of the design from the very beginning. So building community is the sort of initial step, I suppose.
Exactly. And just to add on to what you've said, so one of in this first assignment that I had to do, where you had to respond to 5 other people. It wasn't just a tick box exercise where you had to respond, because the second assignment after that involved taking the responses that you had received
there you go.
and now altering your analysis based on the feedback provided by your peers. So you're actually putting into use what you have learned from the other people. It's not just okay, tick tick tick, I've responded to 5 people and I'm continuing now. I haven't actually learned anything from this exercise.
Very
It's
interesting.
fantastic, because it's not just a theory. The community of inquiry framework, it's not just the theories are fantastic, and we need to build our practical application on theories, but it's the practical application that actually is what brings it to life.
Exactly.
All right, we are going to just, Janse, come back to you a little bit and just talk about Edge's coursebook with its community space, and in particular its group messaging functionality. So you've touched on a little bit how you use the Google Sheets and how you use the video from yourself at the gym. Maybe you could just unpack that a little bit about how you can utilize those tools to be able to build social and teaching presence.
Yeah, so I mean, when we started, we created one group. It was only 15 students in that cohort. And initially it's like Katie says, you've got to sort of get people to introduce themselves in some way. I think we probably didn't do it that well in our cohort, but in retrospect we would definitely do that next time. But then once you have targeted discussions that lead to an output that the students have to present, then you can create subgroups, and you can call that group, let's call it a assignment 1 group A, assignment 1 group B, and then obviously allocate students to those groups. Students can also create their own groups if you choose a group leader, that type of thing.
So you could have like a big group, and then you could have little small groups inside that.
Absolutely.
And you could do that as the teacher, but then the students themselves can create
They can
their
also
own
do
groups.
they can also do that.
So much like you would do on a campus, and that's how it would go down
Yeah.
face to face on a campus.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, in our specific case, what we did was we put a Google Sheet link in, like I said earlier, and then students actually went out of the group and collaborated in there. But then the instruction was to create a PDF output out of that and bring it back into the space so that you can keep the discourse inside the actual chat. I think what the students really enjoyed was the multimedia opportunity. So the fact that you can put a voice note in. Not many of them, I think I had one student who did it, but it's very, very useful for the facilitator. And I think what will happen with this cohort is in the next round, with the next course, they will also start doing it. Because that's how it works, you basically learn tools as you go, and then you realize, look, this is a good tool to use in this specific space. Obviously inside the course book itself, there are lots of tools that are usable. You've got highlighting, you can make your own summaries, you can annotate. Feedback from some of the students were that they were using all those tools. Others were using some of them selectively. But it's very useful for a teacher as well. I mean, you could ask your students to create a set of Socratic questions, for example, on a let's say on a unit of learning, and create a set of notes, upload a PDF, and then submit that as part of an assignment or as part of the discourse. You can search the web, you can highlight, you can make summaries. But I think in the chat itself, it was the multimedia, the fact that you've got shortcuts. If you think about it, I'm traditionally from I used to work at a public university, and there, if you had a question for your facilitator, you would have to send the student an email about how to answer this. Now you can say to the students, well, actually just have a look at that video in section 1.3 at 3 minutes and 15 seconds. And then let's have a chat about that. Everything is there. So the student doesn't have to move into another space now. He's sitting in his learning design. Everyone knows at any point in time where they are. It's not a case of this repository of content where, I've just dumped information and it's not purposeful, I suppose.
But that's quite a benefit to the teacher then, or lecturer or facilitator, is that they can draw on that content from previous courses as well, or from previous students. So one student that benefited from it at one particular point in the course, then another student can benefit from it later.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and some of that content, there's no reason why that content can't be from the institution themselves. You know, it could be content that has been created in the past that you haven't brought to life yet. You know, so.
Okay, well, that's a perfect tee up for the next discussion, which is around purposeful content. And maybe just unpacking that a little bit. We live in this content universe where it's abundant. It's absolutely abundant. You just have to Google anything and you'll find some content. You know, and we often say that you can't just say to somebody, here's your curriculum, the curriculum is the internet. There's this kind of overabundance of information or overabundance of content, and how that's actually damaging in a way to deep and meaningful learning. So it introduces this concept of purposeful content. So it's purposefully created for that particular course, and not just for the course, but for the actual outcome that you're trying to learn in the context of that overall curriculum design. So maybe we could just chat a little bit about purposeful content.
Yeah, in e-learning environments, you know, content, is it king still? Not as a dump. I don't think it's a dump of knowledge. It's got to be meaningful, like you said. Okay, do you agree? I mean, it is.
Definitely, and
I
think what Andrew said is so important, because I think there's a big perception or a growing perception these days that, you know, why do we need varsities? Like, all the information is out there. It's at your fingertips. Like, you know, you can Google it. But I think what people often forget is that we don't know what we don't know, and humans are so governed by their biases and, you know, confirmation biases, and, you know, I'm going to search for information that confirms what I think is true or what I know to be true. Or I'm going to search for information that I already have sort of a framework for. But I think we often put, you know, too much responsibility on people to just go find it for themselves. And yeah, we won't get into the whole can of worms of, you know, misinformation and everything like that, but I think that's a very good example of what happens when you don't have some sort of framework which in with
correct.
Well, what do we always say, Katie? There's one thing worse than fake news, and that's fake knowledge.
Yes.
Imagine spending 4 years studying something that's actually fake. And in this digital era, that is an absolute risk. Yeah, I think it's fascinating how content is going to be used as a vehicle for knowledge creation, because you touched on it earlier about numbers of people enrolling for higher education, or what people's perceptions are and views of higher education. And outside of the professions, law, medicine, accounting, etc., it's not always necessarily about the content. It's about your mind. It's about training your brain, training yourself how to learn. It's about neuroplasticity. It's about pathways. It's about learning that skill, which in fact is a life skill. So yes, the content is a conduit for that learning, but it then needs to be purposeful for that learning.
Yeah, exactly. If you're sitting in so let's take an example of when the first e-learning courses came out. People had let's call it the learning management system, and it was, welcome to this course, here's a PDF. It's 40 pages, read it. Yeah, there you go. And then after that, you need to watch this video, and the video is 2 hours long, and you're trying to figure out what the purpose of this is.
And that's still happening.
It's still happening. And I think the anxiety that comes with that, because the student's he's in week number 2, and he doesn't know how many more hours are left of this thing, because he doesn't know what he's going to open next, right? So with purposeful content, it also comes in, you know, is your videos, you know, that you put in your platform accessible and congestible? You know, you can't have, it's short and sweet, come to the point, give them something to do afterwards, have an interaction, so that the meaning making is meaningful and purposeful.
I think also, if we think back to varsity, I'm sure a lot of us had to purchase a whole lot of textbooks, and sometimes even more than one for one subject, and you end up using a few chapters per book, but you've had to spend so much money on various books just so that you can sort of piece together something that makes sense from all the different books. And it's just, again, not purposefully designed. What if you could have all of that in one space?
I think one other thing that's also with the overabundance of content is the whole debate about local content, or let's call it local content for the context, because it also depends on where, contextual, So, we're sitting in South Africa. It doesn't really matter in which environment you're in. I think it is important for a student with his core content to have some base content that is a reflection on their real context, and then you can find, more inquiry about what's going on in the rest of the world as well. But I think that the internet is full of what's going on in the rest of the world. But, it's the core content that I'm looking at. We're looking at some of our content, in like our events management content, for example. All the case studies are about running events in South Africa, at soccer stadiums in South Africa, at, that type of thing. So the same with institutions where we do their content for them, where it's their content. Very often, the actual core content sits on contextualized content.
It ties into Merrill actually a little bit. If you think about it, sort of demonstration, application, integration, like to integrate it into your own life, you've got to have it contextualized.
And it's all based on a problem-centric approach.
Which is a real world problem.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So it really does tie up. I'm going to just conclude this last question because I think it's quite important. Just in Edge's digital coursebook comp space, we have a feature or tool, the contextualized messaging tool. So we discussed the group messaging, Katie, and then we discussed, okay, we've actually got, how do we now relate that to this purposeful content? And this is what the contextualizing allows us to do. It allows the student and the teacher or facilitator to have a conversation on a specific piece of content that they've identified in the coursebook. Maybe we could just expand that a little.
Yeah, I really love this tool. As someone who typically takes screenshots of PDFs and things on screen and then uses the highlighting tool and the little snipping tool to sort of try to identify what I'm about to talk to you about. The contextualization tool is very cool because what basically happens is you highlight the snippet of text within the course book. So whether it's a paragraph, a phrase, a sentence, whatever it is that you would like to discuss or have a question on, and you can then anchor a message to that contextualization, which you then send to the community space. So it looks almost like on WhatsApp if you had to reply to a message and you can still see the original message at the top. So that contextualization is anchored to your very message, and then the recipient can actually click on that contextualization and it'll take them to the place in the textbook where that content is. Exactly. So
and then you can have a thread, so you can have like a threaded conversation then on that piece of content.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, it really is nice that it cuts out the middleman. I can, exactly what I'm talking about, and I think for an instructor as well.
For instructor, very much so. Sometimes, that one student that started taking over the teaching role at some point had an anchored message on it was just before a video, and she was saying, guys, go have a look at this video at 3 minutes and 15 seconds. They've got a nice example there. And then somebody came back and said, no, that makes sense to me now. I see they're also discussing that in exercise 1.3 in transaction this. And another student said, I found it in this one as well. Now the whole community has solved this problem with the video.
To be.
Yeah, exactly.
Just to actually close this off, because I just love this concept of knowledge trading so much, and this whole community of inquiry, social learning, the whole thing is about knowledge trading. It's about sharing knowledge and living in communities where we learn from resources, but from each other primarily. And it's not a new thing. It's been going around for centuries. This is how people learned to hunt and to gather many years ago. And maybe we can just unpack how you see that evolving in the 21st century.
Yeah, I really like that. And there's a quote from Garrison that really resonates with me. And it says, I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines of, all ideas should be seen as fleeting or transitory and only waiting to be proven wrong.
Nice.
And I really like that so much because it just shows that, we shouldn't get stuck in what he actually calls cognitive straitjackets, which I love so much. We learn from one another. That is, like you say, how we have learned for centuries. That is how we survive. If you look at those of you who have children or have studied, child development and how children learn. I mean, we learn from each other.
Exactly.
We need each other to survive. So yeah, I think it's going to continue to grow. I agree with the poll results, where people said it's going to become increasingly important in the 21st century. I think especially where we're looking at, the sort of consequences, if you can say that, of the fourth industrial revolution and, COVID and all these things that are almost pushing us a bit further apart or making things a bit less personalized and a bit less human, if I could say that. We need a human touch.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And absolutely. Andrew, also you mentioned something earlier about graduate attributes. It's like this socialization is almost not about the content. It's almost about creating a functional. Look at our own environments. You can't actually work in an environment today if you can't, send Slack messages and collaborate with people in the workplace.
100%.